They laughed. When he bought the abandoned barn for $1, until they saw the chains in the basement. The prairie carried a sound that was not laughter but something close. Wind scraping dry weeds, rattling tin, and children's voices sharp with mockery. The barn on the edge of Ash Hollow had always been a carcass of wood and shadow, leaning like a drunk against the sky. Its boards warped, roof sagging, windows smashed to dark sockets. Folks said the place breathed wrong. When Elias Boone rode into town, scarred and gaunt from too many campaigns under Union Blue, he asked about the land. 1 acre, 1 barn. $1. The saloon roared when word spread. A scarred fool buying ghosts. Men slapped tables, boots stomping with amusement. Women shook heads at his waist. Children hurled stones at the barn's broken ribs, daring each other to run close, screaming when the wind moaned through cracks like a dying throat. But Elias didn't flinch. He had stared into fields of corpses at Shiloh and Chickamauga. The jeers of Ash Hollow were thin echoes compared to the thunder of cannon and the screams of dying boys. His eyes, black as a storm that never broke, never wavered. The deed was signed with ink and dust. That night, lantern in hand, Elias pushed open the swollen door. It groaned, a voice in the dark, resentful at being disturbed. Cobwebs sagged from beams like funeral shrouds. Dust rose in clouds, choking, tasting of rot and rust. His boots sank into dirt packed hard by years of silence. The barn was wrong. He felt it in the marrow, the air colder inside as though the earth itself recoiled. He raised the lantern. Shadows stretched like black fingers along the warped walls. In the far corner, something glinted, a dull metallic glimmer. He crouched. Iron chains. They were bolted into stone, sunk deep, each link swollen with rust. Heavy, far too heavy for cattle. The cuffs were ragged with torn leather, blackened by time and something darker, something that wasn't rust. Elias's throat tightened. A shiver went through him. His war had shown him cruelty in many shapes, but this was a quieter horror. Chains in the dirt meant bodies once tethered here, lives broken in silence. The lantern flame trembled as though the air itself resisted light. He whispered, voice hoarse against the weight of silence. What the hell happened here? The barn groaned in answer, beams shifting with a sound like bone splitting. Above him, in the rafters, something stirred, too heavy for a bird, too slow for a rat. The sound crawled down his spine. Elias turned, lantern throwing wild shadows across the rotted planks. Empty. Only dust and webs and chains that seemed to breathe when the light touched them. He backed toward the door, boots crunching on dry dirt. The night outside pressed closer, coyotes crying across the plain like widows. At the threshold, Elias stopped. He looked once more at the chains, at the silent dark that seemed to watch him back. He knew then the laughter of the townsfolk would not last. That barn was no joke, no foolish bargain. It was a wound, old and festering, and he had just bought himself a place in its story. The prairie wind pushed against him, cold and bitter. He stepped into the night, lantern still burning, jaw set against whatever ghosts clawed inside. Behind him the barn sighed, long, low, and hollow, as if it was waiting. By dawn, the whole town was buzzing. Men at the saloon whispered that Elias Boone was building a whiskey den, the kind that would draw drifters and ruin wives. Others muttered about a gambling hall, dice and cards clattering in the ghost barn's hollow belly. Laughter lingered in the streets, but it carried an edge of unease now, like a man joking at his own funeral. Only the sheriff, gray-haired and bent from years of dust and law, spoke plain. He met Elias on Main Street, spitting tobacco in the dirt. Men went missing out there, he warned, voice low. Don't dig too deep, Boone. Some things best left buried. Elias said nothing. Just adjusted his coat, jaw tight. He had not survived war to walk away from chains nailed in stone. That evening under the bleeding sun, he took a pickaxe and shovel into the barn. Each strike rang like iron bells over graves, echoing in the hollow rafters. Sweat cut through dust as he tore into the packed floor. Layers peeled back, dust, straw, then hard earth. His shovel struck iron again and again. More chains surfaced, longer, heavier. These were not for cattle. The cuffs were narrow, meant for wrists and ankles. Some were lined with leather, torn and frayed. Others stained with something that had seeped too deep to wash away. Rust, yes, but darker, permanent. The silence pressed close. Even the coyotes outside grew still, their absence louder than their cries. Then, in the half-light of dusk, Elias's shovel unearthed something small. He crouched, lantern shaking. A braid of hair, long and black, knotted around a rusted shackle. His breath stopped. The lantern hissed. That was no ghost story. That was cruelty, carved into iron. Elias stumbled back, stomach turning, his scarred hands trembling. He had seen comrades torn apart on muddy battlefields, but this was a cruelty that outlived its maker. Chains in dirt, hair tangled in iron, proof of lives stolen, proof of silence bought cheap. He wrapped the evidence in cloth, carried it into town. The laughter died. At the sight of the braid, the preacher crossed himself, lips moving in frantic prayer. Mothers pulled their children close, shielding eyes too young for such shadows. Men who once sneered now looked to their boots, shame heavy on their shoulders. The barn was no longer a joke. It was a wound reopened, bleeding across Ash Hollow's conscience, and that was when she came. Outside the saloon, beneath the creak of its swinging sign, a woman stepped into Elias's path. She moved with quiet strength, her back straight, though grief weighed heavy in her eyes. Her hair was black as midnight, braided down her back. Her gaze met his, sharp as a blade honed on sorrow. She spoke in a whisper, but her voice cut through the street like a bell. My sister died in that barn. The world stilled around her. Elias's chest tightened, breath caught. Her name was Inez, daughter of a Mexican ranch hand who had worked these plains when work was scarce, pay scarcer. She told him her kin had vanished one by one, swallowed by the drought and the cruelty of men who promised labor but delivered chains. Her sister Rosa had been the youngest, hopeful, stubborn, full of light. Then gone, vanished into whispers. No lawman sought her. No preacher called her name. White men who had taken her walked free, faces clean, boots polished. Justice never came. Inez's eyes burned as she looked past Elias, toward the horizon where the barn crouched like a vulture. She was chained there, she said, voice shaking but steady in its truth. Her last breath is still in that dirt. Elias felt the words strike deeper than any bullet. The war had taught him about death, but Inez was teaching him about injustice that lingered, that built its nest in silence. For the first time since he rode into Ash Hollow, Elias Boone spoke more than a whisper. His voice was low, like thunder rolling far away. Then we dig, he said. We make it seen. Inez studied him, scarred soldier with eyes like storms. She saw in him something fragile, broken, yet unyielding. Slowly she nodded. From that moment, Elias Boone and Inez were bound, not by law, not by blood, but by grief and defiance. Together, they stood on ground soaked with shadows that refused to stay buried. The prairie wind rose, sharp and cold, rattling the saloon sign. Coyotes howled again, their cries carrying strange echoes, as if the ghosts in the barn were listening. And somewhere in Ash Hollow, men who profited from silence felt the first tremor of fear. The night was still when Inez stepped across the barn's threshold, lantern trembling in her hand. The flame quivered against the draft, throwing broken shadows across rotting beams. Elias followed in silence, his boots crunching on the dirt. He had stood here before, but with her inside, the air changed. It grew colder, heavier, as though the very bones of the place bristled at her presence. Her eyes scanned the walls, the rafters, the floor. Then they fell upon the chains. She lowered herself to her knees, fingers brushing the rusted iron. Her lips moved in prayer, a murmur soft as rain on stone. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her breath and the flicker of the lantern. When she rose, her face was pale, but her eyes burned like fire catching dry brush. They sold her here, she whispered. Like cattle, the words shattered the silence. Elias's jaw clenched, breath pulling sharp through his teeth. He had seen men split by cannon fire, comrades gasping in the mud of Tennessee fields. But this was worse. A barn turned to market, Innocents chained, bartered like stock. Rumors long whispered, hardened into truth. The name surfaced again and again on dry lips. Silas Crook. A rancher once, turned trafficker when drought shriveled the plains. He promised desperate immigrants food and wages, then bound them in chains, selling them south to outlaw crews who paid in gold. When Union marshals rode close, Crook vanished. Some said Mexico. Others swore he rotted in shallow dirt. But his barn remained, and its bones remembered. Inez pressed her palm against the wood as though feeling for her sister's last breath. Then she turned, voice steady, fierce. I will tear down every rotten beam. I will salt the ground so nothing grows here again. Elias watched her, the lantern's glow catching the hard lines of his scarred face. He was a man already haunted by ghosts of war, but her fire cut deeper than any battlefield memory. He nodded once. Then I'll stand with you, he said. But he knew fire alone would not be enough. The truth had to bleed out beneath daylight, to shame the men who profited from silence. Their alliance became talk of Ash Hollow within days. A scarred white soldier, his hand brushing that of a Mexican woman. It was too bold, too dangerous, too forbidden. In the saloon, voices turned sharp. Women whispered on porches, men muttered in corners. Whispers hardened into warnings. The first came as a stone, hurled through Elias's window in the dead of night. Glass shattered across his floor, wind rushing in like a thief. The second was worse. A knife, driven deep into the barn's door, its handle trembling with the force. Tied to the blade was a scrap of paper, jagged words scratched in haste. Leave it buried. Elias read it by lantern light, his hand steady though his chest burned. He folded the note once, slid it into his coat pocket. His silence was an answer. Inez found him later, hammering new boards into the barn's ribs, as though defiance itself could be nailed into place. They want us gone, she said. They'll have to come take it, Elias replied. That night the prairie wind rose, howling through the grass, rattling every loose board as though the barn itself was warning them. Coyotes cried in the distance, their voices jagged, echoing the pain of the chains beneath the dirt. Inez stood at the doorway, lantern raised, her hair whipping in the wind like a black banner. In her eyes burned not fear but fury. Years of silence had hardened into something sharper. Elias saw it and felt the pull, deep and dangerous. She was grief and fire bound in flesh, and he, scarred, weary soldier, was being drawn into her war. He did not resist, for the prairie itself seemed to whisper, carrying with it a promise of violence, and Elias Boone knew. Ash Hollow's shadows had begun to stir. Ash Hollow dressed itself in respectability, wearing politeness like a mask. Church bells rang on Sundays. Men tipped their hats to widows on the boardwalk. Laughter spilled from the saloon doors at dusk. But Elias Boone and Inez Herrera had begun pulling that mask loose, and beneath it, the rot showed clear. The deeper they dug, the more names surfaced. Merchants, cattlemen, even a deputy sworn to uphold the law. Men who had once lined their pockets with Silas Crook's trade. They still sat in pews, still raised their glasses in toast. But under those Sunday hats, guilt festered like a wound never cleaned. One name struck hardest, Mr. Danner, the dry goods merchant. An old man with a kindly smile, the sort who sold sugar on credit to farm wives, and always had peppermints for children. But in his ledger, Elias found strange notations, initials, dates, sums too neat to be mistakes. When they confronted him, Danner's hands shook. He glanced at Inez as though her very presence accused him. "Don't stir old dirt," he hissed. "It'll choke you!" Elias lifted the ledger and slammed it down on the saloon bar. The crack echoed through the room. Whiskey glasses rattled. Conversation died. Every eye turned. Inez's lantern-bright gaze met the crowd's, unflinching. In the silence, the truth spoke louder than any shout. Whispers spread like prairie fire. By sundown, half the town knew. By morning, the other half guessed. And with whispers came the lash of fear. Threats followed. Riders circled the barn at night, hooves drumming menace into the dirt. Shots cracked from the dark, bullets burying themselves in timber. Elias answered with his rifle, each thunderous blast reminding Ash Hollow that he would not bow. but the pressure grew. One dawn he found blood smeared across the barn door, glistening wet in the pale light. Whether it was a warning or a confession he could not tell. He only knew it meant the war was no longer hidden. Still, Elias rebuilt. Each beam he raised beside Inez was an act of defiance. Each nail driven into wood was vengeance hammered home. She stood shoulder to shoulder with him, her sleeves rolled, sweat shining on her brow. Sometimes their hands brushed, sparks passing quick as lightning between storm clouds. Sometimes their eyes caught in the lantern glow. Breath held for a heartbeat too long. Desire smoldered in the cracks between work and danger. It was forbidden, tangled in the law of men and the chains of culture, but it burned all the same. One night as they worked by firelight, Inez spoke, her voice trembling like the flame itself. "They'll hang you for standing with me," she whispered. Elias drove a nail home with one hard strike, then leaned back, sweat dripping down his temple. He met her gaze, his silence heavier than any vow. His eyes told her what words could not. He had chosen his place, and it was beside her, but Ash Hollow was boiling. Too many names had been spoken, too many shadows dragged into daylight. The circle of guilty men began to close. They would not let secrets breathe. Word reached Elias by way of a frightened farmhand. Bounty hunters were coming. Riders tied by blood to Silas Crook himself. Men who had inherited not just his land, but his cruelty. Their boots were already on the trail, their rifles hungry for silence. The barn, once a ruin, now stood reborn, a skeleton fleshed with new beams and iron nails. Yet to Elias it was no longer just shelter. It was a line drawn in the dust, a battleground waiting for blood. He loaded his rifle in the dark, listening to the prairie wind as it pushed through the grass. Somewhere in that sound, he thought he heard the chains of the past dragging closer. And he knew, before long, the dirt of Ash Hollow would drink deep once more. The storm broke without warning. The sky hung black and swollen, a vault of thunder waiting to split. Ash Hollow slept, but the prairie did not. Wind howled across the grasslands, carrying with it the low rumble of hooves. Riders came at midnight. Torches flared like cruel stars, their light bouncing off gunmetal. Elias Boone woke to the shatter of glass, the barn wall blooming with sudden fire. He rolled from his cot, rifle in hand, boots hitting dirt before thought could form. "Inez!" His shout cut the night. She appeared from the loft, lantern tumbling from her grasp. Firelight carved her face in gold and shadow. Behind her, smoke licked upward, the rafters beginning to glow. Shadows swarmed outside, voices cursing, laughter sharp as knives. Then the first bullet screamed through the boards, splintering timber. Elias dropped low, shouldered his rifle and fired. The recoil slammed into him, thunder within thunder. A rider fell, twisting in dust. Another cursed, clutching a torn arm, but more came. Always more. Chains clinked from their saddles, rattling like trophies of the damned. Each sound struck Inez like a whip. She knelt beside Elias, trembling but steady, loading rounds with fingers quickened by fury. Her eyes glimmered in firelight, wild with grief. Flames climbed higher, licking beams that moaned like a dying beast. Smoke curled thick, choking. Elias coughed, wiped ash from his brow and fired again. His world narrowed to iron, gunpowder, and the fragile heartbeat of the woman at his side. Then the door burst inward. A raider lunged, torch raised. Elias hurled himself from the loft, colliding mid-air. They hit the ground hard, fists slamming into mud and flesh. "This land ain't yours to save." "Soldier!" the man spat, blood streaking his teeth. Elias answered with a strike that silenced him forever. But there was no pause. More boots pounded, more fire roared. A bullet tore across Elias's shoulder, hot iron cutting flesh. He staggered, vision swimming. Then came the sound he feared most, Inez's scream. A raider had seized her, looping a chain around her wrist. She thrashed, firelight reflecting off her tears. "Elias!" Her voice cut sharper than any blade. Rage surged through him, burning hotter than the fire overhead. He charged, pain forgotten, shoulder slamming into the man. Together they crashed through burning timber. Sparks showered like meteors, beams collapsing with a groan. The barn gave way around them, a giant dying in its sleep. Roof timbers folded, walls split, smoke rising in a storm of ash. Elias dragged Inez clear as fire devoured the chains, the dirt, the memories nailed into wood. They stumbled into dawn's first light, the horizon just beginning to pale. Behind them, the barn collapsed in a roar of sparks and smoke. What had been a monument of cruelty now lay in ruins, its ghosts set free. Elias dropped to his knees, blood pouring from his shoulder, soaking the earth. His vision blurred, but he felt Inez's hands on his face, her voice a trembling prayer. "Stay with me," she whispered, forehead pressed to his. Ash Hollow awoke to smoke curling above the horizon. Farmers, merchants, children, they all stood in the streets, staring at the black column rising. There was no more laughter, no more jeering. The town had seen what it tried to bury. The barn was gone. But its truth remained, and Elias Boone, bleeding in the dirt with Inez's arms around him, knew the fight was not finished. The fire had only just begun. Morning broke soft, as though the prairie itself mourned. The sky was painted in ash-gray light, and the land held its breath. Where once the barn had stood, only blackened ribs remained, charred beams jutting toward heaven like the bones of some slain beast. Smoke still curled faintly, and ash scattered on the wind, soft, endless flakes, carrying with them unspoken names. Elias Boone lay in Inez's arms upon the scorched earth. His breath came ragged, shallow, blood soaking the torn fabric of his shirt. Yet his chest rose. He lived, though death had circled close in the night. Around them, townsfolk gathered in silence. The children who once threw rocks at broken windows clung to their mothers. Men stared at their boots, shame heavier than any iron. Chains unearthed by the fire lay twisted in the dirt, no longer hidden, no longer deniable. Some bore cuffs, some bore stains too dark to name. Mothers wept openly. The preacher crossed himself, voice trembling in prayer. No one laughed now. Days later, Elias stood again. Bandaged and pale, he leaned heavy on a cane, but his back remained straight. At his side was Inez, her hand steady on his arm. Before the gathered town, Elias spoke, his voice low but unyielding. "Truth don't burn." The words cracked, but they carried. Those who had profited by Crook's chains, the merchants, the cattlemen, the deputy who once lined his pockets, fled under cover of night. Their reputations were dust, their wealth turned to nothing. Ash Hollow rang not with laughter, but with mourning. The preacher tolled the church bell, not for Sunday service, but for the souls chained in silence too long. Elias and Inez began to rebuild. Not the barn, but something new. Upon that scarred ground, walls rose again, timbers lifted not to cage but to shelter. Windows framed light instead of shadow. Neighbors, shamed into aid, brought wood, stone, and tools. Together they raised a home where cruelty had reigned, hammer strokes echoing like hymns. Each board was an act of defiance, each nail a vow. And between Elias and Inez, love grew quietly. Not in declarations, not in flowery vows, but in the language of survival. In the way she tied his bandages at dusk, in the way he steadied her hand on the saw. In scars kissed without shame, in silence shared without fear. Two broken souls had found strength in one another, and from that strength, peace took root. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Elias took a knife to the fresh wood of the porch post. His hand trembled, but the letters carved true, for the forgotten. The wind lifted across the prairie, carrying the words like a prayer, soft as mercy, strong as thunder. The children of Ash Hollow would read it, and their children after. The barn was gone, reduced to ash and memory. The chains once buried now lay in the open, their silence broken forever. The ghosts were at rest, and for the first time, Ash Hollow breathed free.